You guys want to hear something crazy? This is the number of people that I've interviewed in the past 2 years, over 300. These were raw conversations. And it turns out when you give people the security and space to actually speak, you can get into some pretty powerful conversations. After a few hundred of those talks, you start to learn some really interesting things. Some of the things I learned I'm going to be sharing with y'all today, and you'll get a sense of how much the people around you need your help. You'll learn something about yourself, and you'll see why things are the way they are today. I'm Timothy Dang, and I've been interviewing people on social media for the past 2 years and have put out all of those interviews out on the internet, which is kind of crazy. So we're going to go over 3 lessons today, and lesson number 1 is you're boring, and that's not okay. Lesson number 2 is people are starving. And lesson number 3 is where am I going? And so first, before we even start with lesson number 1, what does boring even mean? Dictionary.com defines it as causing or marked by boredom, dull and uninteresting, tiresome. And so now let's hop into a story. I was at church with my girlfriend a few months ago, and as we were leaving, she was telling me, wow, I'm surprised you and Robbie hit it off. He has a stereotype at the church of being someone that's kind of hard to talk to and boring, to be honest. And I was a bit puzzled because I didn't find my conversation with him to be like that at all. And so it really had me thinking of where we are in society today. We're under a state of constant stimulation. I mean, whether it's our phone, our iPad, or our computer, we always need to be doing something. And the other day, a friend asked me, when was the last time I went to the toilet without bringing my phone? And I honestly couldn't even remember when that was. And so I started to reflect, what does that level of stimulation do to us? And so if we're always turned on to 100%, then maybe it's impossible to replicate that same level of stimulation in the conversations that we're having with people in our day-to-day lives. You get to this point where what naturally comes next is people associate that lack of stimulation stemming from either the conversation or worse, the other person, with boredom. And so we find ourselves in situations where we think conversations are boring. There's one thing I can tell you, so you'll never have to deal with this again, and it's to tell you that you're actually the boring one. And I know that sounds crazy, because you're thinking, how is that the case? It's me getting bored in a conversation with someone else because it's like talking to a brick wall. And so what do I have to do with that? Let me explain. I'm gonna rewind 13 years ago for a quote that changed my life. And it's when a teacher told me, if you're ever bored, maybe you're the boring one. Wow. I remember when I first heard that, and I didn't realize how much was packed into that one sentence. I could probably make a whole presentation about it. But to summarize, the quote puts the responsibility on you to create the experience that you want out of anything that you go through in life. And in the example today, we're talking about conversations. And so if you want an interesting conversation, then maybe it's up to you to try and find out, what can I bring out of this other person to get that experience? And we're gonna talk about how we can do that and what that looks like in a normal conversation. There's this thing called conversational threads. And what it is when you're in a conversation with someone, after they finish speaking, there are a million of different directions or threads that you could pull on to explore more about a conversation. And so normally what happens is we pull one thread. So let's look at what that looks like in practice. So we'll pull one thread and we'll be like, man, that was boring. And we'll pull another thread and we'll be like, that was even more boring. And so ultimately what happens is we'll explore this area, and then we'll explore this area, and we'll come to the conclusion that I tried bringing up so many different things and so many different questions, and I just couldn't find something interesting to talk to with that person. And so we'll come to the conclusion that that person is boring. And so what's the lesson here? It's not that you need to pull every thread in a conversation with someone, because that is impossible to get through. Sometimes you only have 5, 10, 15 minutes to connect with someone, say someone that you're sitting with on the bus or someone that you run into at the airport. And so the lesson is, what happens if we could find out which thread to pull that would lead to the most interesting conversation with that person? And so this is what that would look like. In the beginning, you had examples where you were randomly pulling threads and you didn't know which one would be interesting and which one would be, frankly, pretty boring. And so in this example, on your first try, you're pulling a thread and you're thinking about how interesting that is. And so you begin to think about, why is this a superpower? It's a superpower because it gives you the ability to enjoy every conversation or interaction that you ever have. You'll never have to go on a bad date again. Maybe there won't be any chemistry, but at least you'll get a pretty interesting interaction out of it. Your next question is probably how. How can I recognize which thread to pull so that I don't have to be bored in a conversation and I can bring out something interesting in the other person? Well, that's a video I have planned for another time because we could make a whole presentation about that, but we're gonna see what that looks like later. And so that's why you're boring, and that's not okay. Lesson number 2, people are starving. And I think about a few different stories when I think about this lesson. The first story is a couple of months ago, a friend tagged me in an Instagram story, and it was about a question that she was answering from one of her followers, which was, what made you start getting into content creation? And it was a picture of her, me, and another one of our friends. And she said it was because of these two, because of their encouragement, I was able to finally take that leap and put myself out there, which was something that I'd always been afraid to do. And I remember thinking, there's no way that I can take credit for her becoming a content creator. All I did was just give her a little bit of encouragement. I kept that story in the back of my mind and didn't really think about it much until I started to see that theme occur again and again. And to even think about another story, one of my friends is currently training to break a world record for triathlons. And she was telling me a little bit about what her criteria was for a coach that she was looking for. And it turns out that it wasn't about how much they knew about creating training regimens or how much they knew about proper nutrition. The biggest thing that she was concerned about was, does this person believe in me? And I think about those stories in light of all of the interviews I did, and I saw the theme again and again and again and again. And that really made me reflect because I wondered, what is going on? That's when I was reminded of a Jordan Peterson clip that I watched some time ago. And let's look at it together.
It's really something to see constantly how many people are dying for lack of an encouraging word. And how easy it is to provide that if you're careful. Give credit where credit is due. You're a net force for good if you want to be.
Do you believe you're a net force for good?
Net? Yes. No one's perfect. People make their mistakes as they stumble uphill. I thought the marginalized were supposed to have a voice.
It's making you emotional talking about that.
Well, God, it's very difficult to understand how demoralized people are. And certainly many young men are in that category. And you get these casual insults, these incels. What does it mean? It's like, well, these men, they don't know how to make themselves attractive to women who are very picky, and good for them. Women, be picky. That's your gift, man. Demand high standards from your men. Fair enough. But all these men who are alienated, it's like they're lonesome and they don't know what to do, and everyone piles abuse on them.
And Jordan put it there better than I ever could, which is, people are starving and yearning for the smallest amount of encouragement that you could give them, or that anyone could give them. I think this picture displays the idea pretty well, which is just a crumb, just anyone to speak into them in a way that they haven't ever been spoken into before. And it doesn't take much. And that's when I finally realized people are starving for that. And so it made me think about what's going on. Let's look at a few charts that help me kind of think through this. This first chart that we're looking at is indicators of poor mental health amongst US girls and young women between the years 2001 and 2018. And we're looking at trends of suicide, self-poisoning, major depressive episodes and depressive symptoms. Well, that doesn't look great. If we can see, starting from maybe 2010, 2011, 2012, things literally skyrocketed. And so let's look at another chart, and maybe this will help us kind of understand what's going on. That's interesting. So we're looking at the trend of smartphone and social media usage for those same years. And if you notice what's happening around 2010, 2011, and 2012, usage starts to skyrocket. And so I know it's hard to differentiate between correlation and causation when it comes to things like this. The issue of encouragement could be due to a million different things. Whether it's the charts that we just looked at, or whether it's the loneliness epidemic that the US is currently experiencing. The only thing I can say for sure is people are broken, and if I'm seeing that just from a small sample size of talking to 300, 350 people. And so if we think about people being in a really bad state right now, how does that explain how little encouragement there is in today's world? And I think it's a little bit like this. There's a cycle that's created when you don't feel good about yourself. It then leads to you don't encourage others. Because if you're starving for something yourself, then there's no way you even have the bandwidth or appetite to give that to anyone else. It's this constant cycle where you don't feel good about yourself. And because of that, you don't encourage others. And because of that, others don't encourage you because they don't feel like they're even able to encourage themselves. And it's just this constant battle. And so if we think about what we can do to break out of that cycle, a lot of it has to do with being encouraged. And this is what that would look like. The smallest compliment or the smallest example of someone really paying attention to you or really listening to you can really put you in a state of starting to believe in yourself. And the amazing thing is once you start to believe in yourself, then that creates a cycle in itself, which is I feel good about myself. And because of that, I encourage others. And the beautiful thing about how contagious this is the impact that you can then have when you're in a place where you have the bandwidth to encourage others, because then you start to break other people out of that cycle with how much you speak into them and care about what's going on in their lives. And so that's lesson number 2, which is people are starving. And the last lesson, number 3, is where am I going? I realized that after all of these interviews, people are lost. And I can't say for sure why, because it could be a million different things. But what I do know is that we have to live in a world where we're excited about the things that we're doing and the problems that we're solving. And there's this clip from Elon Musk, which I love. Let's watch it together.
What is the future of cars?
Hopefully this can serve as an inspiration to people in Germany and throughout Europe for excitement about the future. I mean, we got to be excited about the future. We got to do things that make us want to live, It cannot always be about problems every day. I mean, do you want to wake up every morning and everything's just a problem? Well, what inspires you and what makes you excited about the future? There's got to be some things like that.
And so now the concluding question is, what can we do about all of this? If you think about it, if you take lesson number 1, which is you're probably the boring one, you learn how to pull on the threads in conversations with people to really get to the heart of what's most important for them or what they're most interested in. And so now the question is, what can we do about it? Well, that's the good news. If you figure out how to pull threads in a conversation with someone to find out what's most important to them, or because what's most important to you, and the concluding question is, what can we even do about any of this? Well, that's the good news. If you can figure out how to pull the right threads in conversation with people, and then combine that with a little bit of encouragement, then you can start to see how that can go such a long way. And seeing that has been so heartbreaking, but seeing how little effort it can take to make a difference in someone else's life makes me pretty happy. And so that concludes 3 lessons I've learned from interviewing 300 people.